O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, Lord, ever present, fill us all things, treasure of good things and giver of life. Come and abide in us and cleanse us from all impurity and save our souls, O good one. So, this coming Sunday, we'll celebrate the feast of St. Kosmas the Aetolian. And rather than returning to our usual sequence of homilies, which we talked about, which would present the Sunday Gospels according to the interpretation of St. John Chrysostom, Nico has asked me instead to speak to you tonight about the life and works of the saint whom we'll celebrate, of St. Kosmas, in other words. At first, this might cause you to have some logismi, or some thoughts. You might say, come on, Father John, I understand breaking from our pattern, from our schedule, to talk about the life of Panagia as we did for the last 2 weeks, or about the Paraklisi. But can we really be justified in making such a schedule exception to our schedule for St. Kosmas? Well, we celebrate a lot of saints on Sunday, and we don't always make such exceptions. So maybe you have dikio for such a thought. So why are we making an exception for St. Kosmas? The answer is simple, I think, to this question. We make such an exception for St. Kosmas because doubtlessly he's one of the greatest saints not only of the modern era, not only of the Church of Greece, but of the universal Church across the ages. How do we know this? We know this for one fundamental reason, without even looking at any of the details of his life and teaching, as we'll try to analyze in detail in a little while. We know this fundamentally because in the consciousness of the Church, he has been granted a very important title. He's been granted the title equal to the apostles. Equal to the apostles. Just let the gravity of that statement sink in for a moment. Equal to the apostles. Equal to St. Peter. Equal to St. Paul. Equal to the 12-numbered band. Equal in the apostolic zeal. Equal in the prowess of his teaching. In the universal relevance of his teaching. Because don't we read the writings of the holy apostles today and receive from them as much benefit as those who read them in our own times? Equal to the apostles also in the miracles he performed. So he is called equal to the apostles. If this alone is not impressive, let's take a look at the company of the saints, the company he shares, for only a handful of other saints in the Church's history have been granted this title. Saint Photini, the Samaritan woman, who conversed with Christ by the well, and then went back to her own people and preached the gospel of Christ to them, she has the title equal to the apostles. Saints Constantine and Helen, who paved the way for the conversion of the whole of the Roman Empire to Christianity. And after his own conversion, speaking of St. Constantine particularly, he made the Christian religion legal by the signing of the Edict of Milan in 318, which virtually converted the whole Roman Empire to a Christian empire. We call equal to the apostles also Saints Olga and Vladimir, who did much the same for the Slavs. And also we grant the title to Saints Kirill and Methodius, who were sent from Constantinople to be the catechists of the Slavs. So St. Kosmas then is equal to the apostles, and thus he finds himself with the company of holy ones who converted entire empires, entire nations. So this is our general justification. Now we'll take a few minutes and look at his life and his works in detail, and in so doing, let the reasons on account of which this saint has come to occupy such a lofty place in the Church's consciousness filter into our minds. So let us begin now with a brief look at his life, which is in and of itself very didactic and full of examples which we might think about for a long time. St. Kosmas was born in 1714 in a tiny village called Megadendros in the Greek province of Aetolia. We don't know very much about his early life, except that he was raised in a pious home, which, as we've seen so many times over and over again in the lives of the saints, paves the way to the acquisition of the Christian virtues. And at the same time, while these Christian virtues were being cultivated in the home where he was raised, This also fostered in him a desire for Christian learning. And so the early part of St. Kosmas' life is devoted to his own education. He undertook the first cycle of studies, either at the local monastery or in the narthex of a local parish church, where he learned to read and write. And we are told that he did this from his own mouth by the age of 5 or 6. So he's reading or writing Greek by the age of 5 or 6. Then he began the second cycle of studies, which usually consisted of lessons in ancient Greek grammar and syntax and the reading of classical texts. So around the age of 20, he began this. Under a certain hierodeacon named Ananias, who we don't know very much about. However, whatever was going on with his studies, we know that in 1749 he left his homeland and took up studies at the Athoniade Academy on Mount Athos, just outside Votobedi, the school, the Athonite school, whose ruins are still to be found on Athos today if you visit. Here he completed the second tier of the studies that he had begun under the hierodeacon Ananias, and he also undertook the third cycle, the highest level of studies in Greece under Turkocratia, where he studied rhetoric, logic, philosophy, and the sciences. So during this period of Athoniada, he was educated by some of the most important spiritual figures of the later years of the Turkish occupation, and there he also had as classmates important figures, particularly from the Kolivades fathers, like St. Athanasius of Paros, who was roughly a contemporary and who was a classmate of his at Athoniada. In addition to sort of this in-depth education, which is pretty impressive for the time, to undergo these 3 steps in a time of such peril and difficulty in Greece, yet St. Kosmas managed to complete all 3 steps. He was also self-taught, autodidactos he was. He sought after learning at every opportunity. And so we know, for example, that he even tried to study under his brother. His brother Chrysanthos was also a great teacher of the nation under this period. And St. Kosmas spent some time learning rhetoric of his own will under his brother. And he also tried to learn as many languages as he could. And so he tells us himself in his teachings that he had learned Hebrew, Turkish, and also Latin, in addition to modern and ancient Greek. Worldly learning, however, was not St. Kosmas' only concern while he was on Mount Athos. He quickly began to absorb the Athonite spiritual life, and while he was yet a student, his biographer tells us that he began to live with the austerity of a monk. People couldn't tell, really, any difference. They couldn't tell he was a student. He devoted himself so fully to the spiritual life during the time of his studies. As many doubtlessly expected then, immediately upon completing his studies, St. Kosmas headed north on the Athonite Peninsula to the holy monastery of Philotheu, where he was tonsured and ordained to the priesthood. Here he remained for some 20 years. Oh, how beautifully he spent those days of his life, writes Metropolitan Augustinos of Florina. Psalmody, vigils, reading the scriptures and the writings of the fathers, conversations with holy brethren and spiritual guides, and above all communion with the Heavenly Father through noetic prayer. These things created an ideal spiritual climate, reminiscent of the summit of Mount Tabor. Here he was far from the noise of the world, far from the tempest which raged in the towns and villages of the Orthodox. And what a storm indeed was raging below, brothers and sisters. Ottoman oppression was proving to be a great tempest for many Orthodox Christians. First, there prevailed a great ignorance of the faith. People didn't know their faith. They didn't know anything about it. There was no one to teach them. The Ottomans, the Turks, made such an effort to do away with anyone who was strong in faith and could educate the people that there were very few people left to teach. And what happens when we don't have people to teach us the faith? We drift very easily. And so the second threat is just as obvious. Faced with jail and death, many people began to convert to Islam. Under threat, first of all, and second of all, because they didn't know anything about their own faith. And so when they were faced with the challenge of Islam, they said, what can we do? We don't know anything. We don't know how to argue against the Muslims. And so the number of Christians, for example, in what is modern Albania, what is today Albania, once was a part of Greece called Illyria, fell from 250,000 to 50,000 during St. Kosmas' time. That's how dramatic the tail off of Christians was. In total, 2.5 million suffered martyrdom at the hands of the Turks. So the Greek nation thus stood in need of a teacher to teach the importance of their faith and to help them withstand the great pressure which was being thrown against them. St. Kosmas, shortly or around this time anyway, began to feel that it was he who was called to be this very teacher. However, he knew it was generally against the canons for a monk just to pick up and leave his monastery and circulate around the world. So he approached his seeming calling, or what he thought to be his calling, with great discernment. Eventually, he reached what Father Augustinos calls his life's Gethsemane, where he was battling thoughts about leaving the monastery to help his countrymen all the time. Every thought was coming to him that he should go and do this. And so he began to pray and fast for an answer from God. And at the end of this period of prayer, he opened the scriptures to a random place, and his eyes fell on the following line from St. Paul: "Let no man seek his own, but every man another man's wealth." This is from 1 Corinthians. Having taken this as somewhat of a confirmation of the thoughts he'd been having, he then submitted his thoughts to the fathers of the monastery, and then finally to Patriarch Seraphim of Constantinople, to be certain that this was indeed God's will for him. And having received their blessings, he departed from the holy mountain and began to pass from village to village, from town to town, preaching the fundamentals of our Orthodox faith. And this he began around 1775. So we ought to take a moment here, however, to ask ourselves, do we follow St. Kosmas' method when we are trying to discern God's will for us? Usually, if you're anything like me, we get an idea, we sort of hum and haw about it for a couple of days. Maybe we superficially tell our friends we're trying to figure out whether it's God's will or not, and then at the end of a few days we do whatever we think is best. Is this St. Kosmas' model? Far from it. This is hardly what St. Kosmas did. When we are seeking God's will, we have to do our due diligence. We can't just run off to Yerunda saying, I had this random thought telling me to go do X. First, we need to pray, and we need to ask God to help us. Then we take these thoughts and we submit them to our spiritual Father, asking him to help us discern if this is indeed God's will. If he gives us the blessing, then we do it. If he doesn't give us the blessing, then we don't. We have to remember not all ideas are good, and some are bad, some are just bad ideas, and some are actually thoughts given to us by the demons. They come from demonic provocation. So we have to submit our thoughts to discernment. But part of this discernment process is us actually doing the work to pray and consider God's will ourselves, and then go to our spiritual Father and ask blessings. So returning to St. Kosmas. How effective were St. Kosmas' teachings and his homilies after he left the Holy Mountain and began to circulate in Greece? Well, we find one example in his biography, where we are told that after the saint had finished teaching in Kephallonia, 10 boatloads of Kephalonians followed him to his next location in order to hear him preach again. While elsewhere we are told that the saint was drawing thousands of men unto himself. This witness from one of the Venetian ministers who was circulating in Greece at the time and witnessed the effect St. Kosmas was having on the people. So finally, in 1779, after this sort of period where St. Kosmas was having such great influence on the people, the Jews began to become angry with St. Kosmas, and particularly because he had been teaching very vehemently that the Christians shouldn't be going to market on Sunday, and this had caused the Jews who were running the markets to lose profit. And so as a result, some of these Jews who had lost cash as a result got together and went to the local Muslim ruler and asked that St. Kosmas be done away with. The ruler consented to this idea. St. Kosmas was summoned, and he was taken a small distance away and hung from a tree, and his holy relics were cast into the river. Miraculously, however, after his body was cast into the river, a monk named Father Mark found them and brought them to the local church where they could be properly buried. And meanwhile, about the same time after the relics had been miraculously found, the magistrate who'd ordered the murder and the martyrdom of St. Kosmas repented, considering that he had murdered a just and innocent and peaceful man, and he allowed a monastery to be built around the church where the saint's relics were interred as a sort of penance for what he'd done. So that's a little outline of St. Cosmas' life. Now let's take a few minutes and take a brief look at St. Cosmas' teachings, and hopefully here gain a sense of why he was so effective and why he had the effect he had on the people of Greece at the time. So how did St. Cosmas preach? St. Cosmas basically circulated with 5 outlines of homilies. That's all he had, 5 outlines that he would use over and over and over again. The first 3 of these were fundamental. He preached them everywhere he went. And if he had 2 more backups sort of in his pocket, so to speak, that if he was asked to say extra time in a village or town, he would use these 2 extra outlines to sort of present the people with a more full picture of the Christian faith. As we said, he circulated, as far as we know, with just outlines. And so as a result, the transcripts that were produced in every place are a little bit different. And so that's why you'll see sometimes when you look for St. Cosmas' teachings, every version of them that's been published is slightly different because they're based off a different version of manuscripts. Every set of talks he gave, though they followed the same general outline, had different details mixed in, taking into account the pastoral situation or whatever God had moved him to say. So the 5 homilies are particularly noteworthy for what? What qualities are particularly noteworthy in them? They're particularly noteworthy for their simplicity. St. Cosmas takes very difficult ideas and he presents them in ways that are accessible to simple village folk. He makes use of images frequently in his teachings. Some of them are drawn from the patristic tradition, others are not. They're things that he found useful to present the faith. For example, he uses one of these as a very well-known image. He compares the All-Holy Trinity to the sun, its rays, and the light it produces. This is taken out of the patristic tradition, but nonetheless St. Cosmas uses it frequently. He compares parents, for example, to branches. He says if branches are healthy, then the fruit receive water, and but if the branches are sick and the water can't get through to the fruit die and wither. And he says so it is with parents. If they are spiritually healthy, if parents are spiritually healthy, in other words, the children will be fed and they'll be well. If the parents are spiritually ill, then the children will, as a result, also be spiritually ill because they won't be able to be nourished. He uses a lot of stories from the lives of the saints in order to make points clear that he's trying to make. He presents passages from the New Testament in ancient Greek, and then what he turns around is he'll turn around and reiterate these same passages in the Motiki in sort of modern Greek, so people could understand. And this of itself, I think, is an important principle because it shows he thought there was some importance to people trying to learn ancient Greek, so that they could know things about the church, they could read books about the church, books about the saints, books of the Holy Fathers. So rather than just skipping the ancient Greek altogether, St. Cosmas would actually read the passage in ancient Greek and then restate it in simple language so people could follow it. I think this is an important principle for us to keep in mind, especially in the modern era where people are beginning to talk about translating Greek liturgical texts and things. There is inherent value, according to St. Cosmas at least, in keeping the ancient texts. So all these things we've outlined, he does in order to make himself understood more easily. And it has been pointed out that this is, in fact, a great testimony to his humility. Why would we say that? Because, as we saw before, when we looked at St. Cosmas' life, St. Cosmas was indeed a very well-educated man. This was no country bumpkin, so to speak, that we're talking about. He had probably one of the highest levels of education attainable during the period of Turkocratia, and was quite capable of writing books on dogmatics, for example, like St. Athanasius of Paros did. But yet he condescended to teach the faithful things that they needed to know. And so St. Cosmas' simplicity is actually a firm testimony to his great humility, in that he chose deliberately to do this. And so what else characterizes? We said, first of all, his works are characterized by their simplicity, by this deliberate effort to be simple. But what else makes them? What else is characteristic of his homilies? Well, another characteristic is that they're incredibly comprehensive. There are few better synopses of the Orthodox faith than St. Cosmas' 5 teachings. For example, I'll just give you a small example of this. In my parish, when I first came here, we did a series of homilies, 20 homilies, sort of offering an introduction to the Orthodox faith. For all 20 homilies, I used as the basis the text of St. Kosmas. That means that what we find in these brief texts, in these 5 simple homilies, is basically an incredible synopsis of the faith. And so on that point, I also recommend strongly, and I'm sure the bookstore has it, if you can find, if I can get it out here, if you can find this book anywhere at the bookstore, and I'm sure you can, I recommend you buy it and you read it over and over and over and over again. It is an incredible synopsis of the Christian faith. If one really takes to heart the teachings of St. Kosmas and spends time over them, he will have an excellent, excellent basis in the Christian faith. So, seeing that we're sort of running in time, what I thought I would do now is take a brief rundown of some of the themes he presents and point out some of the more noteworthy teachings that we find in St. Kosmas' homilies, leaving you to pick up the book and read it yourselves at some point. So the first thing that St. Kosmas talks about at length is the understanding of God as Trinity, the particularly Christian understanding of God as Trinity. And we can see why this would be a particularly important point to go over and over again with the simple faithful, because this is one of the prime points that differentiates the Christian faith from Islam. Christians believe that God is Trinity. So he begins this discussion by saying that God has given hints of who he is all throughout history. We know that God is good, we know that God is just, we know that God is everywhere present, as we say in the prayer. Here he takes the opportunity to remind us of the moral implications of what we believe. If God is everywhere present, he says, then we ought to be aware when we act that God is next to us. We ought to keep that in our mind and use this to weed out bad habits, use the thought of God's perpetual presence around us to stop ourselves from doing bad things. We go to tell a lie, for instance, and we bring to mind the thought that, oh, God is watching over me. It doesn't matter if I get away with it. God knows. God sees this. And so St. Kosmas uses the opportunity when he's teaching even these lofty elements of the faith to bring out moral implications, which is something very characteristic of his work. So at the end of this list, where we've just said, he says God is good, God is just, God is everywhere present, he says that God has revealed himself as Trinity, as 3 persons in one God. And as we said before, he says this is like the sun, which is at the same time 3 in 1. The sun, its rays, and the heat which come from the sun are somehow all one thing, yet 3 things. And so he uses this simple example to sort of convey the idea of the Trinity. And then at the very end of this teaching, when he's talking about the Trinity, he shows us his very patristic, his hesychistic, or his, what is, in other words, his orthodox theological roots, saying that no image is a perfect description of the Trinity, but that if we really want to grasp what the Trinity is, we should, and this is a quote, confess purely, receive the mysteries of Holy Communion with fear and devotion, and then the grace of the Spirit will illumine us to know what the Trinity is. So true theology for St. Kosmas, and he makes this clear to the people, it's a matter of experience. It's not a matter of philosophy. It's a matter of the purification of the soul and the reception of God's grace, and it's a living experience. It's one thing to know about something, it's a whole other thing to experience it within the soul. And this is what St. Kosmas is telling us here about the Trinity. So second, he also speaks at great length about creation, emphasizing that God was moved solely by goodness when he created, that he didn't create out of any necessity. God was not obliged to create the world. He did it because he loves and moves outwardly. Third, he talks about the creation of man, emphasizing that man is both body and soul, and that the body is the cloak of the soul, as he says, that we will eventually return to the earth and be eaten by worms, and that it is the soul which is the person, which gives life to the body, in other words. Therefore, if this is all true, he says, the soul should be the one dictating what we should do. It should be interest in the soul which we use to dictate our actions, not bodily desires. If we allow the body to dictate the soul, what the soul does, we'll be in very bad spiritual condition. So then at the end of this teaching, he says, only he who makes the body the servant of the soul can be truly called a man. Fourth, he teaches a lot about paradise and the fall. He speaks of the blessings of paradise and the joys of paradise, but also the evil of the fall. Why did Satan go after Eve, the woman, he asks, St. Kosmas says. Because he says if he could trick the woman, then by means of the woman, it would be easy to trick the man. This is an important point, I think, to keep in mind, particularly for the women of our age, who sort of talk about needing feminism for empowerment. If one reads St. Kosmas' texts, he sees there's actually a very lofty view of the woman and importance of the woman. First of all, when he talks about creation, St. Kosmas emphasizes the fact that the woman isn't taken from the foot. This is his famous quote. The bone made to create the woman wasn't taken from the foot. In other words, she wasn't meant to be trampled on. She was taken out of the middle, which is more important. And he also says here on this point, he shows us the great spiritual influence that women have. That if the woman is striving spiritually, the men that are attracted to her will also be forced to strive spiritually. But if the woman is uncareful with how she is, and she doesn't struggle, the man will follow wherever she goes. Basically, that's what St. Kosmas is saying. If the woman is virtuous, the man will step up if he's interested in the woman. He'll bring himself up to that level and he'll struggle. But if the women allow themselves to sort of fall on a moral scale, the men will go right down with them. And so this is a great testimony to the spiritual power of women coming from St. Kosmas. He also, on the same point, talking about the fall, emphasizes the evils of blaming others and how this is present in the dialogue between Adam and Eve and God after the fall. Adam, of course, we know, blames the woman. It was the woman you gave me, he says. And Eve says, oh, the serpent made me eat. So Adam blames the woman blames the serpent. And St. Kosmas says about this, do you see what an awful thing it is to blame others, brothers? If we want to be saved, we should blame ourselves and not throw our shortcomings on other people. So a fifth teaching, he teaches about the consequences of the fall and the need for suffering in our restoration, that we actually need to suffer in order to be brought back to God. Sixth, he talks a great deal about the incarnation, that God came down from heaven in order to save us from sin and from slavery to the devil, and that we might become inheritors of the kingdom of heaven. He speaks in detail about the life of the Theotokos, and he compares her at one point in a lovely comparison, which I think is probably taken from the Ex Apostolarian, one of the daily ones. He says the Theotokos is like the censer we use in church, like the censer which carries the red-hot coal but isn't destroyed by it. He says this is exactly what the Theotokos is like. He talks about the power of the Theotokos' prayers. And actually one of the stories we talked about a couple weeks ago, when we talked about the life of the Theotokos and Orthodox devotion to the Theotokos, the story you remember about the thief who prayed the Paraclesi every day, that comes directly from St. Kosmas' teachings. He talks about the church and its purpose, which he says is to teach men to live properly and peacefully in accordance with love, to repent, to believe, to teach them to be baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, to ordain bishops, priests, and deacons. And he discusses at many points the greatness of the priesthood, which is something I think worth mentioning. He says that we ought to, first of all, the proper way to greet a priest is to kiss his hand. And he says also if we were to be faced with a priest and a king, or a priest and an angel, we would approach and take the priest's blessing, because it's through the priest's hands that the body and blood of Christ, the very body and blood of Christ, come to be present on the altar. So even if we were standing in front of a king or an angel, we would approach and take the priest's blessing before we approached either of the other two. He spends a great deal of time talking about baptism, which I think is relevant to sort of some of the things we've talked about in the past few weeks, and some of the questions we've had. He emphasizes, for example, the fact that fonts must be made so that they're deep enough in order to immerse children. He takes the priests aside separately at one point, not takes them aside, but rather refers to them apart from the crowd and emphasizes this point. Papas, he says, make sure the font is deep enough and make sure the child goes under. Because he says if the child doesn't go under, then all manner of spiritual problems can come from that. And so he's very stern in this warning to the priests. And he's not very stern. He's occasionally stern, but he's particularly stern at this point about baptisms. making sure that baptism is done properly. Because if it's not, it can create difficulties for the spiritual life. If the foundation is shaky, it makes life harder. We have to struggle against that. And so in order to ensure that the spiritual life is started on a good foundation, we have to make sure the baptisms are done properly. He speaks in detail also about the Holy Eucharist, describes it in detail. He speaks about repentance, and his emphasis always when he speaks about confession and repentance is the importance of confessing purely and confessing everything. He says, if you have 100 sins and you intentionally confess only 99, then none are forgiven. What he's not talking about here is the instances where we forget something, truly forget something, because the prayer itself, the prayer of absolution, says, if we've forgotten something through ignorance, let it, may it be absolved still. But St. Kosmas is saying if we go to confession with a list of sins and we skip over one on purpose because we don't want to say it or we're embarrassed to say it, then none of what we've confessed is remitted. And so that's an important warning for us all to take into consideration. He speaks beautifully about the great virtue of love. He says something very characteristic. Just as the swallow needs 2 wings to fly, he writes, so we need the love of God and the love of neighbor in order to be saved. So just as a bird needs 2 wings in order to fly, for the man's soul to fly to paradise, he needs the wings of love of God and love of neighbor. He speaks in detail about virginity and chastity, particularly in his interpretation about the parable of the sower, and particularly about bearing fruit, 100-fold, 60-fold, and 30-fold. 100-fold, he says, of course, is to live the life of virginity, as the monastics do, essentially. 60-fold, he says, are those who live a married life, a virtuous married life, and at the end of their lives separate in order to become monastics. This is very common in our tradition, and he uses a story from the lives of the saints to highlight how this. Then 30-fold, and this is the important thing for most of us, the people who bear fruit 30-fold are those who live in chastity within marriage. In other words, they struggle to keep the fasts for married people. They struggle to watch what they do. They struggle to watch the purity of their minds. This kind of chastity is to bear fruit 30-fold within marriage. Also, in depth, he speaks about almsgiving. He says, brothers, the martyrs gain paradise by blood, and the ascetics through the ascetic life. But we in the world will gain paradise through giving alms, through hospitality, and through showing love to the blind and the lame and the poor. And then lastly, he speaks at great length about the importance of education, but not just any education. It's useless to have an education that leads us away from God. St. Kosmas is talking about the value of an education which serves in tandem with our faith and helps us to actually grow in our faith and help other people. And so godly education, St. Kosmas greatly commends, and it's his desire that all people have the opportunity to learn. And so that's what I had in mind by way of an introduction to St. Kosmas, both his life and the importance of his teaching and some of the general characteristics of his teaching. From there, I guess we can leave it to questions if anyone has things they want to talk about or things they'd like to raise from there.
Yeah. Hello, Father. I just wanted to ask about what you mentioned, the priests when they baptize the children. Are you saying if they're not fully submerged, they're going to develop spiritual problems in their later life?
Well, we're not going to say they are, but we're going to say it leaves people susceptible to potential spiritual problems. I think that's what St. Kosmas is saying. We can't say it's a direct correlation. If X happens, Y will happen. But why would we leave something to chance? I guess that's more the warning of St. Kosmas. Why would we leave it to chance when we know the proper way is to proceed through immersion?
Okay, thank you. Just an observation that I noticed in a few churches that the priests are either scared or reluctant
Yeah.
to do that. So, what are we supposed to do in that situation? I advise the priest to fully submerge the child.
You can ask. Lots of people, like lots of cases, priests are. I think you're right to observe. Priests are afraid to do it. Even I, the first time I did it, I was nervous about doing it. But if a parent comes to me and says, Father, I'd really like you to do it this way, then that fear is gonna be gone for me. And so I think probably one thing you could do, a definite practical step, is just to say, Father, if you could do it, could you please do it this way? And then that gives him the opportunity of not being so afraid of sort of the parent's reaction. Because I think in a lot of cases, that's what a lot of priests are afraid of. They're afraid of the first time you go under, and then the parents all freaking out around you.
Yeah.
So if the priest feels he has the sort of support of the parents, that's going to take a lot of the edge off.
That's true. Thank you.
Someone else with you? For the
In comparison to the parable of the Pharisee and the poor man, uh, and to what St. Kosmas says, what you mentioned as well, if you have 99 sins you confess and one is not confessed, that all of them are not. The book that you showed us, I've read it once in Greek and once in English, is a few really, I would say, not harsh, but really truthful, or some people would have difficulty accepting it, where St. Cosmas says, if you would do so many almsgivings and follow all the traditions of the church, he says, if you don't forgive your brother, you will go to hell. And
Yeah.
there's in numerous homilies, he says forgiveness. It's one of those 5 simple things he mentions. So to someone who is entering the church and reads that, it's kind of like shocking for them, I would say.
Yeah.
Like St. Cosmas says that, but in that parable of the Pharisee and the poor man, later on, if you analyze the meaning of the parable, the Pharisee went to hell, and the poor man who was beating his chest went to heaven. So I just want to mention that about the book you showed us. It's not much of a question. It's kind of like a difficult task to actually do it in your life. Some people are they're on their deathbed and they don't forgive the simplest things. And I'm not saying I haven't forgiven anyone, but thank you.
No, it's very important. I mean, it's really, fundamentally, if we boil the canons down, there's 2 things that will prohibit us from Holy Communion. I mean, one is carnal sins, and the other is the absolute refusal to forgive. I mean, that in of itself should really tell us the importance of forgiveness. If it's one of the things that prevents us basically from Holy Communion, that keeps us from Holy Communion, lots of sins we can go to communion with. There are there are sins that we have that we go to communion with, but the fact that the church has sort of so clearly said that the lack of forgiveness is one of the reasons we can't go to Holy Communion, that itself should be an important slap up the side of the head, so to speak.
Father John, there's a question from the Peanut Gallery, and asking, what would be a good way to forgive, meaning the actual function thereof? Because sometimes we may fall to temptation to say, okay, well, I forgive them, but I didn't really do anything about it. I didn't go to them and ask for forgiveness, or to say, you know what, whatever happened, penas mena, execas mena, let's go forward. You want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, forgiveness in that sense can sometimes be a touchy thing, because in some cases there are cases where going back and asking forgiveness is actually more damaging. There are situations where we can actually do more harm by going back and reopening the situation up for people. In fact, sometimes there's even situations, I would say, where our going back is simply our way of appeasing our own conscience without considering the other person again. We just want to be free of it, of the burden of the guilt, and we just sort of put it on the other person. So it's one of these things that's better sort of worked out with a spiritual father, depending on what we've done, depending on the situation. Yeah, usually the obvious answer is go back and ask forgiveness. But at the same time, there are situations where we have to be a little bit careful with that. So, like everything else in the spiritual life, it's important that we ask spiritual fathers who have discernment about these things and determine what the best route for the particular situation is. But it can be a greatly powerful thing. I mean, there's lots of cases where we can go back and ask forgiveness, even if it's been a long time, and that's incredible for people. It can be an incredibly healing thing. But yeah, it's like everything else. We need discernment.
We have a question from Vicky. One moment, please.
Hi, Father. Can your almsgiving be used sort of to be put towards somebody? For example, you do donations or you help somebody and you say to God, I don't want any credit or anything.
Sure.
Please use it towards, my Father's soul.
Absolutely.
So that can always, so it's not like sort of a selfish act in itself?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the more powerful ways of using alms, is to give them for the sake of other people.
So like if you give all your alms for the rest of your life away, does that mean you don't have any alms, counted towards you?
Well, no, because the reality is the fact that you gave them is still to the benefit of your own soul.
Okay.
So it's a double benefit in a certain way. By giving the act of giving them away, by parting yourself from your worldly possessions, you've benefited your own soul, but at the same time you're applying the benefit also to the soul of someone else.
So it's like double alms.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Thank you.
Pater, just to touch on another topic that you mentioned when you were talking about Ayo Kosma, is that you said the parents both should be spiritually well rooted for the children not to arise in problems. But if one parent, or let's say the couple are separated, like in today's society, like how much of the ifini falls on the nuna and the nuno, and up to what age, and what else can you do in that situation?
Yeah, that's an important question, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's particularly important that we have good godparents, solid godparents who are solid in the faith, chosen for our children. We don't always know what's going to happen with ourselves, and so if we end up making bad choices of godparents, that can have a long-term effect on the kids in terms of if we have good godparents, they're going to be able to affect them deeply. But if we've chosen godparents that are sort of nominal just because we went out for a beer with them twice, there's going to be very little benefit for the kids in those cases. So yeah, selection of godparents is a really important thing. As for separation is a very difficult thing, and it's happening sort of more and more frequently. We just have to do parents have to do the best they can individually, I guess. That's what it comes down to. Knowing that the situation is probably going to have some effect on the children regardless. So the parents both have to sort of labor with that in mind, even that they're going to have to make up for something.
Yes. I know it sounds outrageous, but I heard that some parents wanted to change the godparents. That's absolutely out of the question, right?
Yeah, yeah. Look, people can go to anybody for spiritual direction and guidance and stuff. You can't change godparents though, because it's part of the sacramental rite. I mean, that's the problem. Is people get into little disputes and things later on in life, and all of a sudden they want to change things or something. But no, you can't do that.
If they attempted though to do so in a different jurisdiction or something like that, that would be a great sin, correct?
I've never even heard of it. I don't know how you would go about doing that. I couldn't even tell you.
Any final questions for to Father John? Yeah, Simon, Zissimo.
Hi, Father. How is it? How are you doing?
Hi, how are you?
Good. Okay, you made a very, very important, very insightful comment during your homily about theology or a theologian and actually living, like, not just being a speaker, like actually living theology. Kind of reminds me of it's kind of something I read the other day by various holy fathers, St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Maximus the Confessor, and various other ones, where they're talking about the, we're saying how a true theologian is one who first focuses on themselves and purifies himself of their passions first, in order for the Holy Spirit to indwell in them,
Yeah.
and or at least partially purifies himself so that that person can be able to speak correctly or with proper enlightenment. Okay, I understand that's very, very important, and I guess by definition, none of us are theologians, but I'm just wondering, there are instances where I guess we do need to speak. I don't want to say that we shouldn't speak at all, because for example, there was this girl I knew a long time ago, and she's not Orthodox. She was Roman Catholic, but she's not really a practicing Roman Catholic. And we never talk about the faith at all. I don't bring it up. I just try to be friendly, give her food or take her out for a coffee, and that's about it. I don't talk about religion at all with her. I just try to be nice to her, right? And one time out of the blue, she just asked me, like, about the Orthodox faith. She goes, "Can you explain Orthodoxy to me? I'm curious, so in that instance, like, when do we speak and when don't we speak? And I don't know if that makes any sense."
Well, yeah, no, I think the first part of your comment is absolutely accurate. This is the whole core of Orthodox theology, is this idea that true theology is theology which proceeds from experience. And so it's not just St. Kosmas, it's not just St. Gregory Palamas, as you pointed out accurately. This is the golden thread which runs throughout the entire patristic tradition, is this idea that true theology is the experience of the uncreated energies of God in the soul, and then the Holy Fathers experience this grace and then speak about it to those around them, and in order to lead them towards it. And then what happens is the phenomena of ecumenical councils, when a number of fathers who have a common experience get together, they decide on common terminology to talk about what it is they've experienced within their souls. So this is the core of Orthodox theology. So the question is, where does that leave us, who aren't purified and who haven't received grace in that way, the grace of theology, so to speak, or theoria? The first thing is we have to be aware of our fallibleness all the time when we're speaking. That's the first important thing. We can make mistakes easily, being not illumined. We don't feel grace leave, for instance, when we say something incorrect. We have this great susceptibility because of our intellect, and this is one of the aspects of the fall when we talk about sort of Christian anthropology and what happened to the soul of man after the fall. The intellect has a tremendous temptation to take over where the nous has failed. When the mind isn't receiving grace anymore, it's the intellect that tries to kick in and take over. The problem with the intellect taking over is that the intellect is drawn by the passions. And so if we have particular sins in our life, and we try to talk about theology without the experience of grace in the heart, our intellect will be led by our passions, the way we describe theological things.
Ego.
Now, knowing that that's the case, knowing that Father John isn't going to be able to sit down and speculate about theological matters because what comes out is going to be the result of my passions, what I can do, on the other hand, is try very strictly to speak from the words of the Holy Fathers themselves. That means we take texts like St. John of Damascus and we try to know them very well. If we're going to have to relate to people that are not of the Orthodox faith, we try to know St. John's text well and speak about theological themes the way St. John of Damascus talks about them, and not speculate about things outside of that. Because if we speculate, if we start to go into the rational faculty, our rational faculty will be drawn by sin, and we'll say things that are incorrect, absolutely. Or even better, in some cases, most of us don't have the time to sit down and memorize and really have St. John of Damascus's work enter into our souls. I'm talking, of course, me may not know. Probably the greatest synopsis of the Orthodox faith is St. John of Damascus's great work called The Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith. And it's sort of the standard dogmatic text of the Orthodox Church. If we ever have a question about anything, we go to St. John of Damascus. There are instances where occasionally fathers have fallen into error on various points. The Holy Fathers themselves, many of them say that St. John never made a mistake. In St. John's writings, there are no mistakes.
Yeah.
Because St. John is someone who humbled himself absolutely to the highest level. In fact, he begins the great work with the words, "I will say nothing of my own." Everything he says is taken from other fathers, essentially. And so St. John's work is sort of the typical work we refer to. But, we don't all have the time, like I said, to sort of sit down and do this. So what can we do? We have other things available. We have St. Kosmas' book. Like I said, if you read this carefully, you will have a lot of the core things that you need to speak to people about at your fingertips. And I say that without a word of a lie. I say that as someone who now has gone through years of study. I can't imagine a text more impressive than St. Kosmas for its depth and for the variety of themes it touches on. And it's written in a very simple way, a very effective way, with examples, with stories from the lives of the saints, which will make our way of relating our points very smooth, we'll say.
Because I just very, very quickly just wanted to add, because I've also noticed, and I say this from my own personal experience and watching others too, we learn from seeing other people too, right? Sometimes even the saints, things they say and they teach can be taken out of context. And, people can twist it or interpret it without realizing it in a way that suits them, and again, from my own personal experience, I've said things sometimes, and I went back and thought about it and said, you know what, I was deluded. What was I saying? And then I realized it was fueled either by ego or by pride or by, somebody said something that was picking at me, so I had to respond in order to do the right thing, but I was really making things worse.
Yeah.
So again, that's it. That's all I really wanted to say. So.
Yeah, that's a good example. That's a good example for all of us of the requisite humility we have to have. Even if we're relying on the texts of the fathers, we still have to maintain a sort of humble spirit, right? Because if we don't have that humble spirit and we get our back sort of pushed into the wall, we might do something like that. We might come out and interpret things in a way just to serve our own argument or something like that. So that's a very good example to bring up. It's this sort of utter reliance on the fathers, which in and of itself humbles us, combined with sort of a real effort to have a humble spirit sort of in the way we approach these texts.
Okay, thank you, Father.
Yeah, the book that you referenced, Papa, is the Greek version. I know I was looking earlier. We had a version of it here in English.
Yeah, unfortunately, the English version cuts out a lot of stuff.
So I think what he's saying is you'll need to translate that as soon as
I would love to. I mean, there'd be no more soul benefiting task than for someone to translate St. Kosmas. Unfortunately, yeah, like you said, the English version, that was, I think Holy Cross did it. They removed, I won't say removed because I haven't checked into it. I don't know the history of the edition. But there seems to me there are things missing. References to the Jews have maybe been taken out and things like that in order to be a bit more politically correct and stuff. Um,
The version we had part of a series of modern Orthodox saints.
oh, by Cavarnos.
Costin Cavarnos, yeah. And it's a good sign that we've sold out of that book, so we'll have to. And it's actually the first one in the volumes, right? I think there's 7 or 8 in total, and it's the first one, so it's sold out. So one thing I can suggest before we ask for your closing prayers is, as you know, we have our holy monastery of Saint Kosmas literally in our backyard. And one of the first monasteries, and of course dedicated to Saint Kosmas. How more appropriate that we ask for the saints' intercessions, as he did in Greece and throughout in northern parts of Greece, Epirus and whatnot. That he, through his intercessions, may do the same here in Canada and North America, as we need a lot of help. And I encourage everyone to remind you, we have the Vespers and the feast day on Sunday. Saturday Vespers and Sunday the liturgy. So I encourage you to go. Be a very blessed time, and we are blessed again to have the relic, a relic of the saint there as well. And so for us to venerate that and ask for the saints' intercessions and special prayers we can ask at that time. So just a quick reminder there. Father John, if we could ask for your final prayers, it'd be great.
O Christ, the true light, who dost enlighten and sanctify every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments, by the intercessions of thine all immaculate Mother and of all thy saints. Amen. Through the prayers of our holy fathers, Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Have a good night. The Lord bless you all.